Thanks, Maren. It's very nice to see. Lots of lovely virtual claps there. As Maren said, my name's Bella Abrams. I am a trustee of ALT, and I, in my day job, am the Director of IT at the University of Sheffield. So my job today is chairing the panel. So what I will do is first ask my wonderful panelies to introduce themselves. I'll do them in order, and then we're going to start first with Sally, who's got some slides to share with us. So what I'm going to do first, I also probably need to say that Martin Lynch isn't joining us today, I'm afraid, but we will be fine without him. So first up, Lisa, could you introduce yourself, please?
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here, and thanks everybody for turning up. My name is Lisa Donaldson. I am a learning technologist with Dublin City University. I work in the Teaching Enhancement Unit, and I've been there in DCU for the last 8 years almost now. I'm the Eportfolio rollout lead for DCU, which we implemented in 2016-2017, and we now have over 10,000 users of the Eportfolio platform over those number of years. I'm the founder of Eportfolio Ireland, which is a community of practice for ePortfolio practitioners across the country. And since June, I've been a board member of ABLE, which is the Association for Authentic, Experiential and Evidence-Based Learning, and that's a mouthful. So there's my credentials, and I'm just delighted to be here today.
Thanks very much. And I'm going to hand over to Lucy-Anne.
Hello, thanks, Bella. I'm Lucy-Anne Pickering. I'm a faculty TEL partner and learning technologist at the University of South Wales. I was due to be here with my counterpart, Martin Lynch, who is, as you can see on screen, our head of e-learning. I work within the Centre for the Enhancement of Learning and Teaching, which is CELT for short. I know CELT can be many things, but that's what it is for us. And I'm here to I think talk to you from a learning technologist perspective about ways that we have implemented changes to the assessment during both our pivot to our online period and in our subsequent work from September onwards, particularly with regards to proctoring. So I work predominantly with the Faculty of Life Sciences and Education. That's been since September. Prior to that, I've worked for 2 years now as a learning technologist with the Faculty of Business and Society, which no longer exists at the university.
Thank you. Right, I'll ask Sally to introduce herself.
Hello there, I'm Sally Brown. Can you hear me okay? Because I'm told I'm reconnecting.
Yes, we can hear you.
Hear me okay? Super. Right, well, you may wonder why I'm sitting here with a crown on my head. I'm celebrating my Scandinavian heritage for St. Lucy's Eve, which was Saturday, which is, I'm a quarter Swedish, and I thought it celebrate with Stefan our early celebratory feelings. I am retired. I have done many things in my life, from working in prisons and playgroup leader, and nowadays I am a retired emerita professor from the University, where I used to be PVC, learning and teaching, and I keep busy doing lots of writing.
Thanks, Sally. And last but not least, Stefan.
Yeah, thank you so much. I desperately tried to see if I could find a brownie hat or something that resembled the Scandinavia here for Christmas to pick up from Sally, but I couldn't manage in the due time. But so glad and delighted to be here today. My name is Stefan, and I'm the co-founder and executive director of Univise, the provider of WiseFlow, which is a digital exam and assessment platform. I've been doing that since 2012 when we formed the company. Prior to that, I used to be the deputy director of the study administration of the University of Aarhus in Denmark. So I've been engaged in a particular assessment for the last 20 years or so of my life. So really delighted to be here today.
That's fantastic. Thank you all. Right, so Sally has some slides for the first part of the panel discussion. And so she'll cover those, and then I'll hand over to Stefan, and then we're going to have a bit more of an open discussion. So first of all, over to Sally.
Hey Bella, it's Maren here. I think Sally's just
Maren.
reconnecting. So I think if we give it a minute, and otherwise we can maybe swap around the order and ask Stefan to go first.
I will do that. It's probably worth me just going over while we do this the 3 questions that we will be considering as part of this session. So our first question is, what are the biggest issues emerging in online and blended assessment? What role does proctoring play in this, and what impact does it have? And what alternative models of assessment can we adopt? So they're the things that we're hoping to discuss. It looks like Sally has just joined us back again, which is exciting. So I'll see if she's there. Sally, are you ready to go? Not quite. So I think if we can we skip to Stefan's slides? Is that possible, Myron? And then we'll come back and do Sally in a sec.
Yeah, all ready. Stefan, if you can see the little arrow at the bottom of your slide, you'll be able to navigate there yourself.
Yeah, great, thank you. But I'll try. I mean, it's always quite daunting to follow Sally, so perhaps it's a good thing that I get a head start on her now. But I would like to share with you here initially just a couple of slides where we share some of our learnings and experiences from the previous period. Of course, we all know that during 2020, everyone had to, in terms of assessment, had to either cancel their summative assessments or run their exams online due to COVID. In our case, from among those that we work with, I mean, most higher education institutions choose the latter, which really meant that, meaning that they wanted to run their exams online. And basically that came down to a choice between changing as little as possible and therefore transposing closed book assessment from pen and paper to computer, or redesign the exam with an alternative form of assessment. So, and I'll be talking a little bit about that for the next couple of minutes, but let me see if I can go to the next slide here. So just to give you some context here of beyond 2020, this year we started out in 2013, and the 2 graphs here show the daily sessions and user count in WiseFlow from 2013 until now. And what we have seen is a continual increase in digital assessment every half annual exam season. But of course, here in 2020, it's clear this is where we have seen the single largest increase during 1 year, particularly due to Corona. We support a range of different assessment types in our platform. And if we do look at data from 2019 and 20, from all of our European institutions, there's a couple of noteworthy changes. First of all, you can see to the right, there's a significant increase in the total number of assessments from 19 to 20. That 44% increase represents both a rise among existing users, but primarily new universities joining as a consequence of the pandemic. From a high level, we've also seen an increase in multiple choices throughout this year, or multiple choice type exams and remote proctored exams, which you can see over to the right. In case of the latter, we do not offer a full-blown remote video proctored solution, and we'll probably go into details with that later, but rather a soft or minimum invasive approach based on webcam images taken at random intervals, which really is meant to assist in spotting suspicious behavior rather than that surveillance or full-blown surveillance. But there is actually a very huge and interesting difference between the European countries we look in if we go into more details, which we should be here. Yeah. So in Denmark, or in Scandinavia, first of all, which of course is where we originate from, in Denmark, COVID-19 hasn't led to any changes in assessment types at all. You can see here the year. The blue column is in 2019, and 2020 is the green one. That's the different assessment types: open book assessment, MCQs, digital file-based assessment, lockdown essay, attendance-based assessment, and performance-based assessment. practically no difference or nothing has happened during COVID. We continue in Denmark to do assessment as we did prior to that. And it's worth noting here that all courses and modules in Denmark ends with a semester / year exam type assessment. Remote proctoring hasn't been used at all in Denmark, with the exception of a very few couple of thousands. Now in Norway, on the contrary, where we also operate, the pandemic seems to have caused a change towards open book assessment at the cost of the previous very dominant lockdown essay type exam that is very dominant in Norway. You could have assumed that Norway would convert the digital on-site lockdown exams to remote online proctored exam, but they didn't use that at all, which is rather interesting. Particularly as we look towards the UK. In UK, it's hard to sort of give numbers because we, as our platform, have seen an increase, 200% increase in assessments from 90 to 20, and most of that can be assigned to new institutions joining. So it's hard to conclude much, but it does seem as if MCQ type assessment really has been picked up, has become the dominant assessment type among our clients in the UK at least, and perhaps a little surprising, a rather significant uptake of remote invigilation or remote proctoring. 40% of the total UK assessments done in our platform have been invigilated through webcam, but almost all of these has been from institutions joining as a consequence of the pandemic lockdown. So if we go from the UK and then look into continental Europe, which is the last or the second last slide, that is particularly interesting. And this is illustrated here by only data from this year, because all of these institutions we have from Germany, Belgium, and France, they all joined as a direct consequence of the pandemic. Some of them were considering digital assessment prior to 2020, others not, but they were all forced to do something when students overnight were banned from campus grounds. Just like the new users in UK, these European universities seem to all have went with MCQ type assessment. And particularly during the summer period, almost all exams were remote proctored. What happened there was that they all came from traditional pen and paper closed book exams and transposed them to the nearest thing, namely a digital closed book and remote proctored exams. They did not really consider an alternative assessment in type, but rather chose the closest thing to what they were used to. So if you sort of ramp up or just conclude on all of these, I mean, it does seem from our experience now that institutions and countries who had a high or prior high adoption rate and experience of digital assessment, they moved toward open book exams or alternative digital assessment formats, as we saw in the case of Norway, and again in Denmark that was already the predominant assessment form. Institutions with little or no prior experience of digital assessment at scale seem to have been reproducing the pen and paper exam in an online format. And just to underline that, what I've said here, new adopters prove that necessity is the mother of invention. What has been really surprising is the speed of which colleague institutions, particularly from continental Europe, has been able to convert into digital assessment types. They did this over a couple of months in large numbers. So this has been quite extraordinary to see them do so, but of course there's still something to discuss whether the chosen exam type is really the way to go in the future. Yeah, thank you. You can just stop it there, Bella, that's fine.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, and hopefully we have now got Sally. Are you there, Sally?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm here.
Great,
yes.
Go for it.
Right, well, I think the camera didn't like me showing off with my St. Lucy's crown, so I'm just going to do it without camera. My name's Sally Brown, and I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon, and thanks for inviting me. I'm going to be talking this afternoon about some of the changes that have been happening to do with assessment over this very peculiar period. I work very closely with Kay Samble, who I know is also in the conference, and she and I have a fine system for if either of us uses the word unprecedented. So you'll not hear me say it, otherwise it will cost me. Mentioning Kay, all the work that I'm going to be talking about here is work that I've done jointly with Kay just about, and the cartoon at the beginning here is from a colleague of Kay's called Katrina Swanton at Edinburgh Napier, where Kay used to work. And I think she's absolutely brilliant, and there's a credit to her on the penultimate slide. So I'm just going to talk about, with my next slide, what Kay and I have been doing. So on the next slide, that's a prompt, Maren, thank you. On the next slide, I'm going to be talking about what stimulated us to get going. And what stimulated us was the fact that at her university, suddenly, it started to be the case that they were going to have to replace the invigilated exams. What are you going to do in a hurry? So Kay and I have been working in my garden all through the lockdown, and we've worked on ideas about what could you do. Suddenly it's gone overnight. Suddenly you can't have on-campus invigilated exams. And what lots and lots of people did was just simply said, oh, well, we'll just do the same exams, but we'll do them as open book exams. In my view, absolutely the wrong answer, because you need a completely different approach for an open book exam question than you do for a closed book exam question. And if I've got one message to take back from all this period, the biggest issue: let's never go back to the awful old ways where uninvigilated, on campus, unseen, time-constrained exams, they were the default. We really need to focus on more compassionate and authentic assessment. Compassionate because it takes account the needs of the students and indeed the needs of the assessors. Compassion means bearing in mind that the person in receipt of our feedback comments is a real person. Compassion means that when it comes to students doing lots and lots of assignments and handing them in, the staff in real time have to mark them. So let's try and make it work better. And so what we've been doing is to design more authentic and more scenario-based approaches, as in my next slide, it's the 17th of August one. So my next slide shows the items that we've been preparing this summer. Next slide, they're good. And so there they are. First one, March. What the heck we're going to do about unseen exams having to not take place on campus? Number two, if you're going to do it, let's give you some quick advice. Things that we've learned. We pulled in my husband Phil Rates. Let's come up with some dead good things you can do as replacement. Number three, some of the problems with unconstrained unseen with the different kinds of assessment. The next one down, this is the one where I want to talk about writing better assignments. Better assignments, designing it better. And I'm going to pause there in a moment. I don't want to move slides at the moment. And then number five, for people like us, I want to say that what we've been doing over this year is the things that many of us have been desperate to do over the years, and now we've had a chance to do it. It's been a great year, notwithstanding personal loss and sacrifice, of which I share. Great year for educational staff, developers, learning technologies, and so on. But just hopping back before I leave this slide, authentic assessment. I've been saying that if we start off with the learning outcomes and we have a look at the learning outcomes, if they're any good, they've got a nice, buzzy, powerful verb. A doing word in there. So the powerful verb then has an object. So if we're going to ask students to develop, what are they going to develop? A learning pack. That's the object. Well, what kind of a learning pack? A learning pack that enables them to take their biochemistry learning for this year into a context where they're working with foundation year students who are about to come onto this program. And so that's what I'm calling a range statement. And then we wrap it round in a context. You are working in a large microbiology lab. Actually, very appropriately, they are working on COVID vaccine. So using that as your context to make it authentic, start with the learning outcomes, work out what it is they're going to do with those verbs, that's the object, then put the range of statements together and wrap it round. So that that middle one there, writing better assignments, is basically the whole centre of what Kay and I have been working about. We got to do it better. Let's make it more authentic. People talk about authentic assignments as if they are just all about employability. It's a heck of a lot more than that. So, key answer to question 1, never ever return. We've got to capitalise on this massive improvement. Next slide takes us into a little bit about proctoring. So on the next slide, I went and listened to Stefan and colleagues at last year's Assessment in Higher Education conference. And again, I'd like to plug Assessment in Higher Education conference, which will be in Manchester next July. And I'm sure Kay will add something in the chat box for this to help me. And at that last year's conference, I got terribly excited about the work they're doing and terribly interested in the whole idea of what I was at that time wrongly calling cyber invigilation. Over the year, I've started to hear pros and cons. So I'm not going to talk about that a lot more. But what I would say is that if we are focused on designing authentic assessments with elements of individuation and choice, then the whole area of proctoring becomes less relevant. Now, there may be contexts where you want to do formal exams, but Kay and I would argue that actually there's not a lot of places where you can't design better assessments that work better for students, where you actually have to be overseeing students. I'm also very interested in Uniwise's work. So thanks, Kay, for putting in the chat the assessment conference. Do come there. And if you're interested in authentic assessments and want to drop me a quick email, s.brown@leedsbeckett.ac.uk, I've put together some worked examples of what they might look like in 10 different disciplines. If you design authentic assignments with those areas being different, not only will students take to them better, they'll regard them more seriously, they'll engage more fully, but assessment, as Kay and I would always say, becomes much, much more concerned with learning. So my next slide takes us on to think about alternative modes of assessment. And I've noticed, for example, that we've got Lisa in the panel who talks about e-portfolios and others. So I'm not going to talk about that a great deal. But in our presentations, and the one we did in June, we go through a whole load of these. What's interesting? What models of assessment can we adopt? And when I was doing those worked examples for the work I was doing for the University of Central Lancashire, I contacted lots of UK National Teaching Fellows and asked them to help me prepare them. And they came back with all sorts of things I'd never thought of. So the digital collage as an assessment device, the interpretation board for a museum or whatever, all sorts of things there. So I think we need to be very, very much more creative. So to sum up that innovative assessment approach, I come indeed to Katrina Swanton's slide, which is on the next slide of mine, which is the last slide I want to use, because the remaining ones, goodness me, there are 4 lots of references at the end of it. But here you can see Katrina Swanton has taken it through those different steps. Start with the learning outcomes going along the bottom of that cartoon, then the verb, then the object, then the outcome and evidence and achievement, and you wrap that round with context. I think that's going to make post-COVID assessment, there have to be some post-COVID benefits. For me, the change in assessment, which makes it more authentic, more fit for purpose, more compassionate to staff and students, then that's got to be a win. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sally. And as if by magic, the builders have started drilling in my house. I hope it's not too loud. But I'm going to ask Lisa to add any of her thoughts around the first part of the question.
Thanks a million. In short, this could be very short. I just agree with Sally, to be honest with you. I agree that, you know, it's been challenging. It's been a very challenging time for everybody. Particularly for learning technologists, we've had to work extensively to upskill our lecturers and our colleagues. Our workloads have just grown exponentially. I think most of us are looking forward to Christmas as an alternative to the burnout and the isolation that we've been facing over the last number of months. But I also agree that it's been very positive. And that COVID, in a way, has been that catalyst for change. And actually, I have been referring to that work that Sally Brown was just talking about there. The learning packs examples, I have been sharing those with my colleagues here in DCU. And with permission, I might post an example into the chat in a moment, which shows how you can reimagine assessment. This is the time to reimagine it now, from exam question to learning pack. And I'm particularly interested in that idea, obviously, with my Eportfolio hat on, because that's really well imagined as an Eportfolio, where the students can provide a really holistic view of their learning and their understanding through many different forms of media, through real-world activities and using real-world case studies. Bearing in mind that these students can't go out on placement for large numbers of them at the moment. So this is as close to real-world activities as they may well get. So I think that's hugely important. So yeah, the authenticity I'd absolutely highlight. But I think, I mean, there is some reticence to change. There always is. I'm still seeing alternative assessments being imagined as quizzes. And I'm seeing that not necessarily within my own university, but through my son, a first year in another university. And you know, multi-choice quizzes as 100% assessment doesn't test learning. But we are seeing some pockets of excellence arising out of this challenge when it comes to assessment. So I think that's fantastic. We're seeing group work, as Sally mentioned, we're seeing peer review. And I think that's important, because the biggest issue for our students is that sense of isolation, particularly for incoming first years. They're on their own. I did a straw poll of 1 with my son and asked him to give me a word to describe what it was like to be a student right now, and he said lonely. So if there is a mechanism through formative and summative assessment to make those connections through group work and peer review, I think that's important to pursue. And I also think that giving students ownership and some degree of allowing them to engage with designing their own assessment is important at this point. And again, once I stop chatting, I will pop into the chat box some work that we've been doing, colleagues of mine have been doing here in DCU around engaging students as partners in assessment. So I think if you keep it authentic, if you keep students central to the assessment task and engage them with it, then you will end up with a more caring assessment, because I think we need to build in flexibility into all of our assessments, because there's no other way to describe it other than a very challenging time, both for the students and for ourselves as well. So reimagining and designing those assessments with authenticity and engagement is key.
Thank you. Lucy-Anne, is there anything you want to add?
Oh, let me just put the camera on. I think it's hard to add to that. I think perhaps maybe if I just extend the USW context, because I'm a learning technologist working sort of directly at the coalface. But in terms of at USW, we were obviously the same as everybody else. I mean, 99% of our exams would have been taking place in class or sort of face-to-face with invigilators, and that of course had to turn on its head almost immediately. And of course there was, again, as people have said, this the initial scrabble maybe from academic colleagues to replicate what they would have previously delivered in that face-to-face setting, as opposed to kind of rethinking how that might work. As a learning technologist, we have faculty relationships. So in terms of our personal relationships with staff, we had an avenue there to actually begin kind of discussing and raising with them the appropriateness, I guess, of the assessments that they were proposing, to have those kind of initial conversations with them. Sometimes you didn't catch them until the staff sort of came to you and said, oh, I've got this problem. You know, I have maybe an hour assessment that would have been delivered in a hall that my students usually finish and walk out after 20 minutes. And that again prompted, I suppose, what we're looking at is those opportunities for conversations that then lead to that reflection on assessment practice that we can then encourage staff to take forward and obviously benefit from their experience. It's really accelerated the things that we had been hoping to get staff to think about in the next sort of year or so. I think if Martin was here, he'd probably be mentioning our learning environment review. So that's a whole scale review that we are intending to embark on. And I think this whole period has actually changed the way, excuse me, that staff are going to perceive assessments. You know, if we'd have asked them the question, you know, blue sky thinking, what's appropriate assessment or what's good assessment to you prior to this period, the results are going to be very, very different. We had, as you say, the move to things like Blackboard tests. So Blackboard is our platform at USW. Open book assessments, so 24-hour open book assessments, time-constrained assessments, but also staff who were willing to allow that flexibility for their students. We have a lot of healthcare students, for example, who were called essentially to the COVID front line, and there was a recognition, as you've raised, that these students were human, they were under pressure, and maybe if you set an exam for 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they might not be able to attend. So we did have increasing flexibility coming in from staff. And those conversations we've tried to build on. I don't think it's got much less stressful for staff, considering sort of our emergency period online. We did get all of our assessments moved to online. There weren't any assessments that didn't take place in the summer, and I think that was a great achievement. But I think now staff are really thinking they have the opportunity to reflect coming up to our next assessment period on how those assessments can be made more appropriate. And as you've said previously, to really kind of start digging down and asking, well, what are the learning objectives? What is the assessment actually assessing? Is it a student's memory, essentially, their ability to guess accurately from a multi-choice test, or is it a genuine assessment of their application of skill and learning over the course of their first year, second year, or their whole degree? So it's been fascinating. I've been enjoying working directly with our colleagues. My background is originally as a secondary school teacher, and I am actually an examiner at A-level. So if this is kind of all a big melting pot in my head of fantastic ideas. So I'm just absolutely delighted to be here and to share in these really wonderful and positive conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to Stefan in a second, because I think everyone did a little bit of open eyes at the proctoring stats, and it is a kind of opportunity for us to think about why we are where we are with proctoring. So why do you think there was such an increase there, Stefan?
I think it's a little bit, as I said, I think for continental Europe, it was because, I mean, and excuse me for saying, they're doing assessment or exams like we did in Scandinavia perhaps 15, 20 years ago, and that you perhaps did 5 years ago, right? So I think they had to do something really fast. They were used to pen and paper, old traditional exams, and they tried to, instead of rethinking how to do it, with the time strains they had to transpose into something that was really resembled the same as what they were used to. I think in terms of the UK, and I saw from the chat that a few were startled by the numbers I gave. I think that is a poor reflection of what the UK universities have been doing during the COVID. I think it's due to the high increase or pickup of proctoring that we have experienced in the UK is due to someone similar to continental European institutions, someone that primarily had pen and paper based assessment before, and then needed something that resembled that in a short time. I think the majority of the movement in the UK is going in the same direction as we've seen in Scandinavia for many years. Be mindful, it's about 15 years ago since I finished my studies. I haven't done a single exam. I'm an historian and political science by profession. We didn't do exams. We did assignments. We wrote the thesis constantly throughout our 5 or 6 years of studies. We perhaps defended it orally, and that was the main way of doing assessment. There was much more reflected what we are supposed to do in the professional life afterwards. So I honestly think that remote proctoring is an interim thing. I mean, it is not. We will not see. And I know they are quite successful, all the full-blown remote proctoring solution right now due to the need. But I'm 100% convinced that this will only be an interim thing. We will revert back to something different assessment types. And I hope, just like Sally, I think this will be a push for introducing, particularly in the UK, alternative assessment types, because there's so many interesting aspects to pick up from different types that can be utilized, and that remote proctoring it's wrong for so many purposes. We had to do something to cater for the needs of some who were not ready to do the big dive into alternative assessment, but I don't think this is a long-term solution at all.
Thank you. Sally, you've made some points about proctoring. Have you come across any examples of where it has really done some harm in the course of what you've been looking at over the summer?
I've not come across harm as such. What I have come across is quite a lot on chats various where people have said, I really don't like the idea of a camera looking at me, a camera checking I'm there. I don't want everybody seeing my house, my children, me without my shadow or whatever else it happens to be. I think that's probably a misunderstanding of how it can work well. What I'm interested in is, do we know that the person who's using the laptop is the person who's registered to do the exam? And that's where I got excited. I'm not really interested in things where people say, well, you've got to take a photograph of all around you at every 20 minutes so we can tell your mum's not there helping you, whatever. That sounds bonkers to me. But that's, I think, Stefan, you'll correct me, that's a complete misuse of what your work is.
Exactly. Yeah, precisely. So that is what we ensure. So I agree completely here. It's only that we want to make sure that it's the same student throughout the exam rather than that surveillance, which for a number of privacy reasons feel awkwardly wrong. But I think there is an issue here, which is also picked up in chat. In the UK particularly, there's a gap between what universities, or many of them, want to do, and then the, what do we call them, the regulatory professional bodies. I mean, and I see just these weeks, I mean, we are having huge discussion with a number of them because they are really conservative and old-fashioned and are trying, forcing universities into replicating that old surveillance type exam. So there's a battle here in the UK particularly between, I think, universities and where we all see assessment move, and then what the professional bodies are requesting at the moment.
And we've certainly seen some horror stories like that at my institution. People were talking about fairness and access to digital technology, and connectivity is a huge issue. We had, right in the heat of lockdown, a nursing student break the rules because her connection went and she was so desperate to carry on with her exam, and that just feels like there's something wrong there. But that was driven by a professional body. What can we do, anyone on the panel? Is there, other than Stefan's talking about professional bodies, are there things that ALT as a professional body can do? Sorry? Is that you, Sally?
I wondered if I just might go back a bit to why. Yeah, that's me, Sally. I'll put my camera on. I'll risk it. I want to say something about our senior managers in universities. Can you still hear me?
Please,
Wave at me if you
please
still hear
do.
me.
Yes, I
I
will
want to
wait.
say something about senior managers. And as you know, I used to be in the senior management team, and there are so many senior managers who are from a science, engineering, medicine background, that they often think there's only one way to do assessment, right? Particularly if they are my age or only a little bit younger, and they've got very narrow views. I also have a small rant about when I was a PVC, how many PVCs for learning, teaching and assessment were not familiar with current learning, teaching and assessment literature and practice. So what I'm saying is that within universities, the blocks for innovative assessment are often from conservatism with a small c, and the same with the professional and subject bodies, because they tend to be full of people, this worked for me, so it must be right because I got here. And I think what we've got to do, as I said in the chat, we need to storm the barricades. We need to change things. We need to make it no longer acceptable that we herd students into sweaty, unpleasant rooms with hundreds of others where they're under stress and they're not doing their best. Let's let them do their very best.
And I think that stands for COVID or no COVID, doesn't it? It's actually we've been pushed. Yeah, and we're in a position where we've had a pandemic allow us to have these conversations because everything changed so much. But actually, I agree with you. Let's storm the barricades. I think that's a fantastic idea. Lisa, is this something do you feel moved to storm the barricades, or are you already storming?
I do feel moved. I sat one proctored exam once in my life, and I hope I will never ever do that again. I'm really concerned about the additional stress that puts on students, particularly now when it's already a stressful time. It's not inclusive. It shows that we have a lack of trust in our students. And I have been genuinely moved by some of the awful stories that I've seen running across Twitter with students in tears reporting on their experiences. And I think it's absolutely terrible. We don't, within DCU, engage with proctored exams. If there's an absolute need for an invigilation of exam, it's done over a live Zoom session. But, you know, in general, I think it comes back, as we're all saying, to the design of the assessment. Now, we do need to educate others, whether they're the senior managers, probably less so, but certainly the external, perhaps awarding bodies. They need to understand that, you know, if you redesign assessments, you involve the students, as the research I posted there earlier shows. If you engage the students, if you involve them in lower stakes assessment, it reduces the cheating aspect. And if you embed more reflective elements, you write out plagiarism. So there's a lot that you can do, but there needs to be engagement to do that.
And this is, in effect, answering the third question of this session, which is what alternative models can we adopt? How much do you think confidence needs to be built in the assessors, who we also need to have compassion for? Do you think that's another key blocker, is them thinking about doing assessment differently? Lucianne, is that something, because you're there supporting staff?
Yes, sorry, a key blocker to, I think it just cut out as you were saying that. Could you just repeat just the last half a sentence?
Yeah, do you think that confidence in changing models of assessment is a blocker for staff?
Yes, I think so, but I think it goes back to staff having trust. I saw someone popped in the chat about meaningful and authentic assessment, and I'm hoping we can come back to kind of those two words, actually, because I thought that was quite interesting for somebody to pick up there. Staff confidence in knowing that a different form of assessment is equally valid, I think, is where a lot of the uneasiness comes from, particularly in my conversations with staff. You know, is it an actual assessment if it's not a test? Is it an actual assessment if they don't go into that room and they don't sit down? Is it an actual, you know, truly valid assessment if they're not all there being watched at the same time? And those are the kinds of conversations I think we found we were initially having when we had to move online, and we had this discussion about flexibility, because we have students from, I'm sure other people do here, completely different time zones. You know, all of the students went home. They went home to the Middle East, they went home to China, they went home to the USA, and to have a sort of academic, you know, trying to grasp how they could produce an assessment that would, like you say, be not cheatable, essentially, even though you students were technically in different time zones. Also for religious reasons, you know, thinking about Ramadan and things like that, it's really kind of brought to the fore those conversations. So I think a lot of nervousness came from that. We actually had started doing some work on trying to expand our staffs, and I'm just going to pop into the chat. I think I've got it right. If that link doesn't work, do let me know. Expand our staff awareness of assessment in general ahead of this. We had a high dependency, not just on exams, but on the use of things like Turnitin, where staff were clinging to the similarity scores, and you notice the students were too. You know, and what we were trying to do was getting staff not to hang their hats on that, to recognise that actually there are many reasons why a similarity score might be high. You know, the important thing about a student's work is not that percentage that you see, you know, on the screen. We therefore produced some infographics to actually try to expand our staff's awareness of, you know, the huge variety of tools that we have. And I think we've been lucky that our staff are, on the whole, actually quite receptive to trying new things. We have a lot of vocationally facing staff, and they are looking outwards, I think, which is an advantage for us, because they're seeing in industry the tools and the ways that things are being done that they want to replicate. So can I have my students do an assessed video presentation? Can they do a vlog? Can they do a blog? Can they do a website? You know, can they create a wiki and have that assessed? Because those are skills that they are going to be taking forward. They are our graduate attributes, essentially. So I do consider myself lucky in some senses that our barricades that other people might be storming aren't necessarily so high. We do have a lot of buy-in for alternative forms of assessment. And I think, as you said, that kind of comes from the top. And what we need to deal with now is everyone is so enthusiastic about moving assessment online. We really need to look at this as to how we take it forwards, you know, and have those conversations. For us, proctoring wasn't necessarily, I mean, it was an issue for us because the only regulatory body who wouldn't kind of move on those proctoring regulations were in law. So anyone else who has supported law with the Solicitors Regulatory Authority will have had a similar experience. But we were lucky that every other professional body we work with was buying into that. So I think those conversations are happening, and you asked what ALT can do. You know, I think as a collective is to bring that to those professional bodies and say, look, you know, other professional bodies are doing this. We can demonstrate that it works for you. We understand there are some things that maybe do need to be specifically done. And you know, for us, in terms of that proctoring, you asked if we'd had any bad experiences, and myself as a learning technologist, I have watched some very distressing video footage reviewing some students proctoring videos, you know, and trying to identify, and students getting very, very, very distressed. And you sort of think, if that's what it's like going forwards, you know, ethically, I'm not sure, you know, that was distressing for me as a viewer. It was distressing for the student, even more so. They were the one taking the exam. And you sort of think, if you know, if this is going on, we need invigilators who are not just, you know, your normal people who do be there and walk around the room. Yeah. They have to have an entirely different skill set. And it's actually, you know, I sort of, it made me feel a little bit, this is what moderators on the internet, you know, of kind of graphic content must feel like, because I just wasn't prepared for it. And when you train students, you know, when you train staff to use the technology, actually, you have an idea of kind of how invasive, I suppose, it's feasibly going to be. But when you see it, it brings a whole new dimension to it. So we've been lucky, we've been able to resolve a lot of our issues, but I think I can echo, we need to really consider, I'm talking away, but we really need to consider that going forwards.
Brilliant, thank you. There are two things. One, the file that you sent is not a web link, it's a local link. And two, Stefan has his hand up, so I think he has something to say.
Yeah, I think I agree totally here with the last. I would just like to stress that I think it's super important for us to realize that digital/online assessment does not equal proctored exams. On the contrary, I would say digital and online assessment actually allows for authentic assessment by letting students use tools and apps and possibilities that they're used to in their daily teaching, and that they will be doing in the professional life afterwards. So I think, I mean, not to repeat myself, I think the proctoring thing is just an interim thing. I think it will go away. I'm super optimistic for the future, because I do think that this COVID situation and the general transition into a digital and online format will now pave the way for the true revolution of digital assessment, hensely that it supports authentic assessment in new ways. So I'm quite optimistic, and I think we will see lots of progress now, because we've been struggling for 7 or 8 years to get people sort of to build up an infrastructure in order to take advantage of the online assessment. That has all been suddenly paved the way for in no time. So I'm super excited about the future, and I think we will see less proctoring but more online and digital assessment.
Which sounds excellent. So we've got 6 whole minutes left of our session, and I do have one question in the chat from Deborah Arnold. I'm going to ask Sally about this because she raised it earlier, which is how can authentic assessment be scaled for large cohorts?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think the answer is that you've got to find systematic ways to write authentic assessments, and if you make sure that the framework you give them gives quite limited amounts that they write in each area and quite limited sizes for the activities, then it becomes actually easier to mark, faster to mark than standard lengthy assignments. But that's why in the examples I create, I say no more than 200 words, or no more than 1 large sheet of A4, or something like that. We've got to put constraints on more open kinds of assessment. Otherwise, assiduous students and students who aren't organized will simply chuck everything in like a Christmas pudding. That's not how it works. They've got to be selective, and they've got to frame, and that's what makes it a really good assignment.
Thank you. So I've asked for other questions from the floor, and one has not appeared yet. So I'm going to ask Lisa, what do you think are going to be the big changes around ePortfolios and the things that you talked about at the beginning, around the fact that students are not having their kind of external experience that they might be having normally? What do you think are the big changes that are going to be afoot here?
Thank you for allowing me to put on my ePortfolio hat. It's great. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to pop an example link into the chat box here that actually colleagues, Sharon Flynn is here today, on the Enhancing Digital Teaching and Learning project, have put together exemplars of technology enhanced assessment. So that's in general, which I think is very useful, that we could all benefit from looking at the range of technology enhanced assessments that are available. But speaking of ePortfolio specifically, we're seeing critical mass now, certainly in my own context, when it comes to ePortfolio based assessment. COVID was actually the tipping point for adopting ePortfolio based assessment, and it's providing our both lecturers and students a way of I suppose, more holistic assessment. They can personalize Eportfolio pages and responses to establish their identity. And again, that's kind of important when everyone is remote, to be able to establish your identity. I think that's very important. The reflective elements that we're all talking about that need to be built in, Eportfolio is designed to support reflection. Creativity and all of these new technical skills that students have gained by learning online, they get to represent that digitally in assessments as well through using Eportfolio and different media as part of it. So it allows them, I suppose, a 3D or almost 4D opportunity to represent their learning. And what we're seeing, just to give a single example, whereas we would have normally had in DCU approximately 30 different modules engaging in Eportfolio-based assessment in a given semester, we've gone from 30 to 140 this semester. And I've worked directly with pretty much all of those lecturers in designing that. And I'm seeing really interesting, meaningful, authentic assessments coming through as part of the Eportfolio.
That's fantastic and very well timed as well. So it's just time for me to wrap up and say thank you to everybody on the panel and the very, very engaging chat as well. It's been a really positive, reflective chat. So I suppose my final question is does anyone feel that they haven't covered anything that they wanted to say as part of the panel? Is there a burning issue around how assessment is going to be completely different this time next year, or we've touched on the ethics and we've touched on kind of compassion? Is there anything that we haven't covered at all in the last minute? This is good, and hopefully, audience, you've got the answers to all of your questions. It's been a really lovely opportunity to chair this panel, and I've learned a lot. And we'll be feeding it back into senior managers, of which I am one at my institution. So it's been really, really helpful, and I'm feeling enthused to storm barricades for after Christmas, which I think is the general sense from the floor. Thank you to all of my fellow panelists. Thank you to Maren and Alt for everything in the conference, and thanks for everyone in the chat. It's been a really lovely, warm and engaging session. I'm really happy to be with you. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bella, for sharing, and thanks, everybody.